This is The Secret Library, a podcast about writing and publishing books. I'm Caroline Donahue, a life coach who works with writers, and I'm here to tell you this is your year. It's time to stop waiting and start writing. Okay, everybody, this is it. If you've been waiting for the last minute, the very last moment to sign up for the Coffee Shop Writers Group, you have reached it. This is the last minute. As of the release date of episode 85, you have about, it's midnight on Thursday. You have 48 hours until the doors close for this round. So you can check it out at carolinedonahue.com/coffeeshop. Join 11 other writers to plunge forward for the next 6 months. Follow the journey of the major arcana of tarot and get that draft down on paper. Have you been putting off your book? Maybe you have. Have you been listening to this show hoping one day it'll be time to write your book? It is time. It is time right now. So sign up and we'll see you in the group. We start Monday, January 15th. This is episode 85. My guest this week is Cecil Castellucci, who's the author of books and graphic novels for young adults, including Boyproof, The Plain Janes, The Year of the Beasts, Tin Star, and the Eisner-nominated Odd Duck. In 2015, she co-authored Moving Target, a Princess Leia adventure. She's currently writing Shade the Changing Girl, an ongoing comic on Gerard Way's Young Animal imprint at DC Comics. Her latest book, Don't Cosplay With My Heart, came out January 2nd, 2018. Her short stories and short comics have been published in Strange Horizons, Tor.com, Womanthology, Star Trek Waypoint, and Vertigo SFX Slam. She is the Children's Correspondence Coordinator for The Rumpus, a 2-time McDowell Fellow, and the founding YA editor at the LA Review of Books. She lives in LA. I am so happy to have Cecil on. She is so much fun, and one of the few episodes, actually the only episode as you'll hear, that's ever been recorded in my home right in front of my face. So she came over and we recorded together. I know you're going to really enjoy this conversation. We dive into YA, her latest book, writing for young people, and lots of other issues that are kind of prickling people lately about censorship, writing sensitively, and considering all audiences when you write your work. So this is a favorite episode because I think the topics are so important. And even though it's just the beginning of the conversation, I'm really glad we're starting it. So here we go with Cecil Castellucci. Hey, Cecil, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So this is another fun one. This is the very first time for those of you listening. This may make absolutely no difference to you at all listening to the show, but to us, this is the first time I have recorded in person with someone in my office, in my home. So if you notice, some sort of different vibe, maybe we're creating podcast history, at least for this show.
Yeah, we can jam off each other.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of fun. I'm like, oh, somebody's in my office. Oh, we do live in the same city and not that far away. So
yeah, I'm just like down the road.
Amazing. So you have a book coming out. You've written many books, but a new one, which is one of my favorite titles of recent history, Don't Cosplay With My Heart, which is super cute and everybody should read it. I read it literally in one sitting.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. My first novel that I wrote was called Boyproof, and it was about a girl who dressed up as her favorite character and went to school basically in cosplay every day, and it was like about nerds. And that was like my first book, and it was one of the first YA books that had sort of a nerd front and center as a character rather than a sidekick, and that was like 15 years ago. And so it was really nice to kind of revisit that like at this moment in time where like nerds are mainstream and it's just a completely different vibe. So it was kind of fun to revisit a nerdy girl being sort of front and center in a book.
I think that's another interesting, I have so many things I want to say about that, especially about like nerds shifting from the side to the center, which I think is a huge thing as somebody who grew up when nerds were definitely not cool and
definitely not cool,
shoved off to the side. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing was this kind of proof that people were looking for. Some of the characters who are kind of jerks, there are some jerks in the book who are constantly kind of quizzing her about whether or not she's, quote, a real nerd, unquote. And I think that that's something that hasn't changed about adolescent culture, even if you see different groups that are now the cool group. So I loved that you put it felt very believable to me granted, I'm fairly far away from being an adolescent now, but as someone who has been one and had sometimes a tough time with it, to really keep that emotional experience of what it's like to be uncertain and not sure who you are.
Yeah, well, I think actually it's not even just a thing with adolescents. I think that a lot of, gentlemen in the nerd community actually do quiz girls on whether or not they're a real geek or a fake geek girl. That's actually a thing, I've certainly had it happen where, people have sort of tested me, or they've asked me if I'm picking something up for my boyfriend, or if I'm into something because my boyfriend likes it. And it's so shocking to me, because it's at this point, when you go to a Comic-Con and it's 50% women, 50% men, it's what are you talking about? At this point, this idea that nerds, this false idea that nerds are these sort of sad gentlemen who sit in the basement of their parents' house playing video games is just completely false. It was false back then, and it's false now, and it's more annoying when gentlemen do that. There's big problems, when you look at Gamergate, or a lot of these, things, or a lot of the boys who are sadly upset about characters being gender swapped, or anything like that. There's this there's this feeling that they have, I think, where their spaces are being invaded, but they're not being invaded. It's enhanced. So I wanted to talk about that in the book, because I think it's important for girls to realize that they're not alone. That Eden is sort of wait a minute, why am I being she's kind of struggling with it, and then she kind of figures out that that's not cool. But I think when you don't know, when you're just sort of, well, maybe I am a fake geek girl, maybe I don't know anything about the thing that I love more than anything in the world. I think that sort of place where you can see that someone else is struggling with that same thing is okay, well, right, they're stupid and I am a real geek, and there's no measure of it.
I'm sort of mystified by this. I think that it's at first, you have people who are unhappy about feeling unincluded, which was sort of the experience of being a nerd back when I was in school. It was if you were too excited about something, or you were too enthusiastic, or you read too many books, or you were too into it, then that was an issue. But now that it's cool to feel that way about things, you would think that people would be happy, but instead it's almost you think about people who are hazed and then turn around and haze other people. It's sort of the same process that you see oh, well, now that you think my group is cool, you want to be a part of it. It's almost it's this cycle of bullying and shoving in and out of groups.
Yeah, I don't really get it. You kind of think about it like punk or something like that too, right, where it's people discover this thing and it's theirs, and then it becomes mainstream, and then people are well, you're a poser, or whatever. It doesn't mean that punk doesn't still exist. Punk totally still exists, just that thing that you love still 100% exists and is there for you. So and
more people are excited about it, but I guess it's sort of this mentality of is there more for me, or is there less for me if more people like it?
Yeah, or maybe people feel like they're going to get left out of the thing that they love, and that can be certainly scary. I get it, but at the same time, it's I think they need people who have that fear should, or what's the gentle way of saying it, perhaps could consider reframing, their mind in thinking that there's an enhancement. The thing that's really stressful for me is I love Doctor Who. I've loved Doctor Who my whole life. It's not my number one fandom, but it's certainly something. I was watching it, when I was a little kid. I have got my favorite old school Doctor, and all of that stuff. And I would say that I'm well versed in Who-ness, in the Whovian lore. Yeah. But at the same time, it's I know that there are other people who know way more about it than I do, but that doesn't make me less of a fan. The measure, the only thing that you need to be a fan of anything is, like you said, is enthusiasm. And it doesn't matter. There's always stuff to be discovered about the thing that you love. And that's amazing.
Yeah. And I think it's a great message for young people reading a book like that. I thought there were a lot of really great things. Maybe we can talk about the way that you translate an idea that you want to discuss into a young adult audience, because a number of the things that I really loved about the book were, Eden's kind of inner processing of, is it okay that these boys are acting this way? And the way that the kids responded to maybe somebody whistling or, how it was wearing a costume. And that I think it's interesting to think about issues that would be challenging for young people to handle or maybe to address or to stand up for themselves about, and then to use something like a book to be a positive influence for that.
One thing that I have not cosplayed in a long time, but at my first science fiction conventions when I was a young girl, I did cosplay. I went as Leia. My favorite was Jessica Six from Logan's Run. What I liked about it was that it made me feel like it sort of brought forth a different aspect of my personality that was shrouded or that was hidden or that was in shadow or whatever. But it gave me the bravery to sort of bring out this other part of me, And I think that's the great thing about cosplay is that it sort of gives you this sort of another color of yourself comes out, And I wanted to talk about that. And in the book, Eden is going through a pretty tough time. And the way that she deals with, the sort of stuff that's going on in her family life is by dressing up as this character, Gargantua, and that gives her the sort of power and the wherewithal by donning the outfit of this superhero to be able to deal with the crisis that she's going through in her own life, And I think that that's really important because the thing that I think is important for teens to know is that there are many different tools strategies to deal with sort of crises in your life, So that was one thing. The other thing is that I didn't want it to be, I have it's a fictional team that she loves called Team Tomorrow. And,
I wasn't sure if it was fictional until partway through. And then I was like, I think she made this whole thing up. That's so amazing.
Yeah, I made it up. My mom, too. My mom's so cute because I made one of the creators of Team Tomorrow be this woman named Jeanne Bernier. And Jeanne Bernier is the name of my grandmother.
Aww.
And my mom read the book and my mom was like, oh, I never knew that there was a comic book creator named Jeanne Bernier, just like my mother. And I was like, no, Mom, I made it up. I named it after.
This is an homage, not an uncovering.
But what I wanted to do was I made it a fake superhero team because the thing is that if I made it Wonder Woman or any other fandom that we already have, it would either be dated or somebody would read the book and be like, well, I don't like that character, so why would I don't like that. So it's better to make up something in order to be able to sort of let anybody sort of put whatever they want on it. But how do you, my dilemma was, how do you make a reader like a fandom that doesn't exist? And so my idea was that I would have these interstitials that would tell you the sort of history of this comic book, and why it was important for women, why Gargantua was important for women, and what its place was, in the canon of iconic superheroes, in order for the reader to be able to be like, oh yeah, I get why she would like this team or why she would like this comic book. So I'm glad that it came off as though
I was like, wow, she did a lot of research. And then partway through, I was like, maybe she made all of this up, which is, why wouldn't you make it up? Because that's also really fun to come up with it.
I think there was one review that I got and I'd made one mistake, and of course I got nerd-splained, but like the review was like, Cecil predates having a black superhero on a team by a year. Like, I predated like Black Panther by a year, and I was like, oh. I got it so almost right.
Oh my God.
But then I was like, whatever.
Year.
It's like flexible. It's flexible alternate history.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. That's amazing. I think it's great to see, I think it really worked because it also works in terms of if you're not like a big comic book reader in the sense of you don't know the canon anyway. Right. So somebody who doesn't know the canon, I think I still really enjoyed it. And I live with a very active comic book reader, and I do read some myself, but there's no way I'm in the most active, or I don't have like a working huge vocabulary, and it was still totally relevant to me.
Yeah, and I think that now when we have comic book movies and, comic books are so mainstream, science fiction, fantasy, all those things are so, they are the culture now. Everybody knows that stuff. Everybody knows the vocabulary. So you know it just as much as anybody else does because it is mainstream culture.
Yeah, I'm just not qualified to nerdsplain.
No, nobody is, and everybody is. That's the joke.
I know, everybody's liable. So I want to talk about a little bit, because there was an article at the time of our recording. This is going to come out when the book comes out, which is only like a couple weeks apart. Yeah. But so I can say this as recent. There was an article in the New York Times about this concept of sensitivity readers. Mm-hmm. And so as we're talking about people being inside of groups and outside of groups, and I'm wondering, from what we talked about briefly before starting to record, it seems like there is an easy way that this concept of sensitivity reading could be sensationalized and potentially scare people off from writing for young adult audiences, when your experiences with it have been that it isn't like a censorship experience, and it depends on how you interact with it. So I wanted people to maybe hear a little bit about your experience, so that if they're considering writing for young adults, they don't read an article like that and think, oh my God.
Well, I mean, first of all,
get crushed.
I think it's always a good idea to have people read your book and make sure that you're not messing things up. Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, I wrote a book about outer space, and I had a spacewalking scene, and I called up NASA and asked them if I could talk to a spacewalking expert. I mean, maybe...
Did you just go online and look up NASA and just call and say, can I talk to somebody about spacewalking? Because that is amazing.
No, I have an acquaintance who's a rocket scientist at JPL.
That's so
and I
awesome.
Emailed them and I asked them if they knew anybody at NASA. And then they introduced me to somebody who wrangled the astronauts. And then they helped me set that up. And so that's been really helpful. And like... that astronaut, Rick Mastracchio, and I are friends now. And so like sometimes I'll have like an astronaut question, and I'll just shoot him an email and ask him like a basic question or whatever. And, you know, sure, he's not reading it for my, you know, for the sensitivity of walking in space, but, you know, I'm going to the source and asking. I mean, I think the important thing is that any writer, it doesn't just have to be for adolescents, any writer should probably be doing some research and looking around, and, you know, and I think the thing is that people are going to make mistakes, and there are certainly things that I've put in some of my previous books that maybe I wouldn't put in now because it's like I've evolved. But, you know, I had this was before there was the term sensitivity reader, but I had a character in my second novel, The Queen of Cool, who had achondroplasia, which is dwarfism. And I'm an adult of short stature, so I'm technically able to join the Little People of America. So I joined the Little People of America, and I went to the meetings, and I asked, I said, I would very much like to have a teen who has achondroplasia who could read my book to make sure that I got it right, and that, you know, that things are ringing true and stuff like that. And that was just obvious to me. That's just an obvious thing. You know, I'd love to write a Western one day. You know, you can guarantee that if I write a Western, I will be having people, you know, who are Indigenous people reading the book as well, because it's like, I can't write about that, you know, like I don't have that cultural background. And so I would have done that anyways. So I think it's a smart thing to do. I don't think it takes anything away from your book by getting something right or getting something closer to right, you know, in terms of voice and in terms of history, in terms of accuracy and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. The other thing is that, like, no matter what you do when you write a book, someone's mad. Like, sometimes when I get freaked out about writing a book, I'm like, oh my God, who's going to like this book? People are going to hate it. And I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot. Someone already hates this book, is so angry about it, and thinks it's the worst thing that's ever been written. So there's no way that any time that you write a book that you're going to be able to please all of the people all the time, but you can do your best to try to get it, you know, as close as possible. With Don't Cosplay With My Heart, you know, Kirk Gomez is one of the characters who's, you know, one of the boys in the book, and he's a pretty main character and stuff like that. And I definitely had, like, you know, one or two sentences in the book that my editor, who's Latina, was like, you know what, you should take this sentence out, you know, and it didn't change anything from the book. It was just like I was like, oh gosh, you're right, I should take that out. I was trying to do one thing and it fell flat and it was dumb, and so we took it out, you know. So yeah, I think it's excellent.
Yeah, I mean, I think
that was really long. I'm sorry.
No, it was great. I do think that it's easy to sensationalize this kind of thing, like, because I mean, you look at things that are on the news, and like news writing tends to sensationalize things. So I read an article like this, like, oh my goodness, there was a book that was going to come out and they got 900 angry reviews on Goodreads, and then the publisher delayed the book. And it's like easy to get nervous as a writer, but I think what the point of a book is to tell a story well.
Oh, yeah, I know what book you're
and
talking about.
so, yeah, so then, you know, when you see something like that happen, it's easy for people to go into fear and like, oh, that would happen to me. I can't put my book out. But I think that if you're going to write a story about an experience outside of your own, which I think everybody should try to do because it expands your... If you have a character that comes to you that needs to be in the book, I'm not saying force it, but if you decide that there's going to be somebody in the book who has a different experience than yours, and that causes you to go out and have new conversations with new people that maybe could give you some pointers and help you with that, then I think that helps everybody.
Yeah, and I mean, I also think that, like, you know, I think I know what book you're talking about. And this isn't necessarily for that book, but I think there's also this thing where there are different people who come into young adult literature. Maybe they have a career in adult literature, and then they come into young adult literature, and they think that they're doing something really great for teenagers or whatever. This has happened for years. And and they don't know anything about our world, and they don't know anything about our field, and they come in and they sort of swing their, you know, I am going to make the most important book for children because I am, you know, whatever.
So.
Yeah, and I think that that's another problem. Do you know what I mean? Like another problem, like there's, you know, you have to understand that as a person who writes for young people, most people who write for young people still get asked the question, when are you going to write a real book? You know, I have 18 real books, and they happen to be for young people, but that doesn't make it not a real book. And so sometimes, and this happened like 15 years ago after the, you know, Harry Potter came out, and everybody was like, oh, I'll just do a land grab and like make a lot of money. You know, adult literary people were coming in and just like, I'm going to write for children now because it's super easy and like it doesn't matter and I know what's best. And, you know, and so I think there's a lot of different levels that's happening there. And I think there have been a lot of books that have been problematic. And I think that, but I think that the fundamental thing is that there's no problem. Nobody is saying, not one person is saying, don't write the book that you want to write. Nobody's saying that. What they're saying is that that's fine, but if you're going to write outside of your lane, do it right and get it right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the only thing that I think anybody's really saying. You know, and at the same time, too, it's like, I think it's really stressful for a lot of people of color who are writing, you know, young adult books because, you know, historically, publishers will say, well, we already have our book with, you know, a person of color on our list this season. So we already have that book. And then a lot of the times it's written by a white person. Well, you know, move over. You know, I mean, that just seems very obvious. Move over.
Yeah, or make more room. It's just like, what, nobody's going to read books of different experience. I mean, I think that there's always room for more experience and more stories and more kids seeing stories that reflect their own experience.
From the voices of people who actually have that experience, you know? I mean, I think we just need to bring way more people in, you know, and it starts at the top, right? We have to have like more editors and agents, you know, who are not just white ladies. Although I love
we're not hating on the white ladies, but we could make more room. I just think there needs to be more room. I think that's always the answer, is like making more room for more stories. Because the other thing that I keep hearing about is like people are like, oh, you know, it costs money to publish books. So of course they have budgets and all of that. But I also think about, for everybody who's writing books, those people are reading more books than they're writing. So every time you make room for more writers, you're making room for readers who are then reading more books. Like, it's just... I just don't think we're going to run out.
It just sort of also, it's like the more people that you invite to the table, the better your feast is going to be. So invite more people over.
Yeah, exactly. You know, have bigger dinner parties.
Yeah, because I think that it doesn't, you know, it just raises the level, the quality level for everybody. But anyway, that said, I don't think there's any problem with having sensitivity readers. You know, I think it's always a good idea to have beta readers anyways, and to ask those questions if you're a writer of your editor, like, should we get someone to read this? Like, I don't know about this. Should we discuss this with someone? Or, you know, should I go to, you know, the library and read some books, yes, you should,
Or should I go to a convention, or should I go to a group, or should I call NASA, or whatever it is?
Yeah. I mean, I take a lot of, I haven't been doing it in the last year, but I like taking these online, massive online college classes, MOOCs.
Oh, cool.
And I take a lot of history classes. And I take a lot of history classes because I find that history is a really interesting frame. It's interesting to stir ideas for world building when you're trying to come up with galactic politics for places. And it's also very interesting just in general. And then you become more knowledgeable and more sensitive when you're thinking about stuff like, oh, I know why this is important. Even if this is not my story, I can get it. Not even just in my own writing, but in reading other people's books, where all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I understand the reference here. It's like learn history.
Totally. Well, that brings me to something I want to ask, because as somebody who's written 18 real books, as you said, of course, coming up with ideas for 18 books, like, you're taking online courses, you're coming up with worlds, all this, because you're not only doing these books, you're also doing comic books. So you have all of this output that's happening. So how are you fueling the input, and where do you find that your ideas are coming from for these stories?
I mean, I think a lot of it is like living, I mean, I think, it's like I like to, a friend of mine called me a sensualist the other day.
Ooh.
And I was like, what's that? And they were like, you like to go and see things and taste things. And I was like, oh yeah, I totally do.
You're like, other people don't?
Yeah, that's weird to me. But
Yeah.
I feel like that is your job as an artist. Your job as an artist is to go and experience things. That's not to say that I don't sometimes spend like 3 straight days in my pajamas playing video games and doing nothing. I totally do. But, like I'm going to Denmark and I'm going to go see a whole bunch of things and feed my eyeballs. And I try to travel. And whenever I travel anywhere, I try to go to a place and see things, like a historical thing or a museum, or, I try to take online classes to learn more about things. I try to have interesting conversations with people who are way smarter than I am. So that I can learn. Both my parents are scientists, so I try to pay attention to, what's going on, science-wise. And I find that, like every single thing that I do like that inspires me to no end. Whether or not that makes me, write 12 new novels, or if it's just like I get a bunch of ideas and then I just kind of file them away. But I do have a running list of books that I want to write one day.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I have like a whole bunch. I have about 10 now that are books that I haven't gotten to yet that I want to write one day. And so I just keep, I have a notebook and I write them all down in my notebook, in the back of the notebook, and then I just try to chip away at them.
And then you finish one, you're like, okay, who's next?
Right. Another one gets slotted in.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think having all of those, like, sometimes it's just a little piece. It's like, somebody tells a story or somebody's in a situation or they say something, I'm like, there might be something to that. And then just write it down and come back to it. And sometimes it gets stuck onto something else. And it's like, ooh, wait, what if those things happen at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not one particular thing. Or sometimes there are like ideas that I have that are twinned in a way. I feel like there are 3 books that I wrote around the same time that was dealing with the same kind of grief and trauma that I was going through, and I addressed them differently. But when I think about those 3 books, to me, they are all the same book. They're all, like, it was like I rewrote the same book 3 times, but in wildly different ways. So one of them is this book called The Year of the Beasts, which is a hybrid novel, and it's alternating chapters of prose and graphic novel. And the prose is it's the story of 2 girls in the summer and the boys they like and the carnival and jealousy and fighting, and whatever. And then the graphic novel is a girl who's turned into a Medusa who just wants to be a girl again. And her friends have turned into mythological creatures as well. And she just doesn't understand why she's not a girl. And the books don't seem related. And then at the end of the book, you see how they intersect. So that was one. And then the second book was First Day on Earth, which is about a boy who believes that he's been abducted by aliens. And so he starts going to an alien abduction support group. And when he's there, there's a guy there who's either a crazy homeless person or an alien. and they go on a road trip. And then the third book is Soupy Leaves Home, which is a graphic novel that I wrote about a girl who runs away from home, dresses up as a boy, and rides the rails as a hobo in 1932, and meets this sort of magical, and she's completely shut down from trauma and grief, and meets this sort of magical hobo who helps her to sort of see the world in a different way, like for her to move forward. And they're wildly different books, but to me, I have this problem I need to solve. How do I solve it narratively? Or and to me, they're all twin, they're triplet books. They're, they're twinned in some way, even though they're very, very different. And I think that just happens to us as artists. We get an idea and we write it one way. It doesn't work out. So we write it again. We write it again.
Or there's themes that are always interesting. Like, I think you can explore a theme in many different ways, but it could be like, I'm just still interested in this thing. I'm still really interested in these kinds of situations, or I get excited in these kind of situations. So they just keep coming back around.
Yeah.
So how are you seeing the difference in kind of YA, kind of what you're seeing in the trends in writing for young people since when you started with the book like 15 years ago and seeing it now? Like, what are some shifts you're seeing in how people are writing for that audience?
Well, first of all, there are a lot more people writing young adult now than there were when I started. I think it's probably a lot harder to break in nowadays than it was when I was starting out, because there weren't really very many people that were doing it. I mean, there were, but there weren't as many as now. I mean, now, because it made so much money, because you had things like Twilight and The Hunger Games and Harry Potter and just all these huge series books that Divergent, like it became sort of this huge moneymaker. When I first started writing young adult novels, we didn't have our own section in Barnes & Noble. We were just in juvenile fiction. It was all in children's literature. It wasn't, I mean, I can say the same thing for comics. I started writing young adult comics 11 years ago with my first comic book, The Plain Janes, and they wouldn't even shelve it in the young adult section. Now there's like a whole YA comic section, so it's the landscape of the bookstores and the libraries has completely changed. So it makes it, it like the marketing category has really exploded. But I think it would be probably a lot harder to, break in with like a quiet, small book in, young people's literature now, because I think people are looking still for that big sort of, what's the next franchise? What's the next, big thing? If you look at like a lot of like fantasy, I think some of the best fantasy is happening in young adult literature. And I think a lot of that has to do because fantasy and romance sort of melded. And so you have this thing where they did a study a few years ago where I think it's something like 65 to 70% of people who read young adult fiction are actually women over 35. So then I feel like it becomes this sort of, well, who are you really writing for? So that's a very different thing. But that also goes back to the point that it's a real book and that, like young adult fiction it just means that the action is happening to a young protagonist immediately and it's not a nostalgic look back. That's the only difference between an adult book with a young protagonist and a young adult book with a young protagonist.
Yeah, this fascinates me. This does come up over and over again with people who come on the show who are in some sort of genre, and there's always some sort of reason why the area in which they write, like even within that, like we've had people in on romance who wrote romance in a particular way, and other parts of romance were like, well, that's interesting. And it's just fascinating to me how cliquey writing can get, just like any other arena. Yep. It's like, aren't we all sort of like still in middle school in some ways, emotionally?
Which is why anybody can write a young adult novel, because it's like when people ask me like, how do you channel, your young adulthood, like how do you remember? I'm like, have you been alive lately? It's like every single thing is still like, where's the cool kids? Who's the nerds? Who's like, what table do you sit at lunch? Like what's the clique, And so I feel like, you don't have to stretch your imagination that far to like feel like you're in high school again, because just live your life and it's going to be drama.
Yeah, it's amazing to me. It's just like, oh, a real book. It's just so weird to me because I think in many ways, I mean, I haven't been the one who's been getting that particular critique for those particular books, but I think in some ways it's like gotta be from people who don't actually write, right?
No.
Really?
No, it's from adult authors as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, because
everybody knows how hard it is to write any book.
Yeah, but I think that there are some adult authors who, you know, look, I have a lot of friends who are adult literary authors, and I think a lot of them are really wonderful. But I have had some of them, you know, sort of say to me, oh, well, I would never read your books because they're not for me. But why aren't they for you? They're a perfectly fine book, and you can read them in one sitting, one long bath. Put a fizzy bomb in there, fizzy bath bomb in there, and you're good to go, you know, like, and they're good books, you know, but they're not, they just think like, well, it's not for me. Just the same thing. People do the same thing with comic books. Oh, I don't read comics.
Right.
I don't read comics. So I'm not going to read what you do because I don't read comics. I'm not going to, you know, and I think it's just, it's their shortfall, you know, I mean, there's nothing I can do about it. Like, you know, but then of course they'll read Harry Potter, you know, but that's different. Oh, I read The Hunger Games, but I'm not going to read your book because that's a kid's book. Like, I don't know. It's like weird. So yes, it is not just non-writers that do that. Actually, I would say that like any civilian that I sit with, like next to on the airplane, you know what I mean? They don't care.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because I think it's just fascinating to me because there is this default in some ways of like real books being literary fiction. Mm-hmm. And if you write crime novels or you write romance or you write thrillers or you write sci-fi or anything like that, it's somehow not a real book, even though
absolutely
you're far more likely to be able to do that for a living.
Yeah.
You know, if to be a writer full time at that than in other genres.
Well, you know, they lose out.
Yeah.
I don't lose out because I read it all. It doesn't matter to me. I mean, I think the one genre that I don't read very much of is like, you know, straight nonfiction.
Uh-huh.
You know?
Oh, that's not what I thought you were going to say. I was thinking of like the one thing I don't read is I don't read really intense horror because it scares me too much.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have read horror, but
I'll read like I'll read like a suspense.
Yeah.
Some people would call hardcore suspense horror, and I will read that. But like, if it's like the equivalent of those slasher movies, you know, where they're like Hostel or Saw, like I can't handle it.
I can't handle that either. But I might read one of those. I would be more likely to read one of those because I'm just a fiction girl. I like fiction, you know, not that I don't read nonfiction, but it's just, that's not what you know, I'm not going to read that book on Hamilton that inspired Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Right. That's good. Like you either have to get it on an e-reader because or you have to just get really good triceps.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it might crush you.
Yeah. And I'm glad that he was inspired by that, but that's not where I just would not have picked that up.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? Yeah. Too dry for me.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like, the difference between taste and what people choose to read versus writing off genres that they don't know.
Right. And it's interesting because it's like I might not read that kind of book, but if a university was offering a massive online college class on, you know, the founding fathers, I would totally sign up for that and, you know, do the 12-week coursework for that, you know? So it's like, you just get it in different ways, I guess, you know?
Yeah, I think that's the nice thing about being a writer now is that there are so many more ways to research, get information. People are more, you can connect with people so much more easily. Like if you want to talk to somebody in another country about their experience about something that you're researching, like all you have to do is get on the computer. Yeah. I can't imagine how long it took to write really heavy research books, you know, even 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about, I know we're getting close, but what are you writing next?
Oh, well, I'm still working on Shade the Changing Girl, which, you know, has, we, you know, just started on the new arc of that. And I am, The Plain Janes, which is that first comic book that I wrote. Me and Jim Rugg, who's the illustrator, we just got the rights back. So we're doing a third book in that series. So I was working on that earlier today.
Awesome.
And yeah, so it's about a girl who was in a terrorist attack and found a sketchbook that said art saves. And when her parents move her to the suburbs, she decides that she's going to start an all-girl guerrilla art group to make an attack be something beautiful. So she does art attacks instead in order to deal with her trauma about that. And so it was a 2-book series, and Jim and I had always thought of it as like one more book. And so we're getting a chance to finish that. So that's going to be pretty exciting. It's going to come out in Little Brown in 2019. So I'm working on that. And then I've got an idea for a new novel that is like really going to be difficult. And I mean, nobody has bought it yet or anything. It's just like an embryonic idea in my brain. And so I'm going to try to work on that one.
That's so cool. So would you ever sell one before you had written it at this point? Or
I've done that before.
You have?
Yeah. Don't Cosplay did that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, just had like a synopsis on what I wanted it to be. I would say maybe a third of my books I've sold just on a pitch, and then sometimes I've sold it on the whole thing. Or
that's amazing, because I only have heard about that happening for the most part with nonfiction, where you can write like a proposal and have an outline in a couple of chapters. But being able, it's like, because you had a relationship with the people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you probably couldn't do that never having written a book before. Like,
no.
I think this will be pretty good. Here's some thoughts.
It's happened different ways, right? I mean, like I've had it where I've sold a 2-book series. One was a pitch for what the first book was going to be, and the second one was an untitled Cecil Castellucci book. So then I had to pitch what that would be to my editor. Yeah, it's about half. It's about half and half. I don't know. Careers are weird. You just kind of, sometimes it works out this way, sometimes it works out that way. I mean, I like it when I just sell it on a pitch, because I'm just like, just trust me. I'm going to write a book, and it's going to have words, and it's going to have a story, and it's going to, work out. But then it's also, that's a lot of pressure, because the potential of what that book could be, in the publisher's eyes is like different than like what is actually on the page. And so sometimes it is actually easier to just be like, well, here's what the book is. Do you want it? We can work on it. It's done, but we can edit it.
Right.
And I can revise it, but it's like, the baby's born,
rather than, I thought it would look a little different.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, they both have their charms, and they both have their problems.
Yeah. That's awesome.
It's nice to sell it on a pitch, because then it's like I can get paid while I'm writing it, rather than not have any money. I mean, not that I get paid that much, but I'm still starving. But
having it in advance is good.
Yeah, exactly. So that way it's like, at least it's like when I'm writing that first draft, I can do it. I mean, I guess the thing that I've learned now is that I can write a book. Like if I'm 100% certain that if I sell you a sentence and I say this will become a novel, you will get a novel.
Nice.
It will get done. But yeah, writing is hard.
That's the summary of the whole episode. Writing is still hard. I mean, it is hard, but it is worth it.
Totally worth it. I mean, it's the best thing in the world, right? I mean, we just get to sit around and make stuff up. And I just want to grow my craft and learn more and get better. It's like the nice thing about writing Don't Cosplay With My Heart, which is like nerdy girl front and center who cosplays and whatever, and my first novel being about a nerdy girl who cosplays and goes to school, is that I got to revisit and reinvent the idea that I had that launched my career, right? Like in a completely new way. And now I'm a more sophisticated writer. So I think it's, I love that first book, but this one is very different. It's got more gravitas to it. And if I rewrite something again in 15 years, it'll be different then too.
Yeah, and then you can see them all in a pretty cool box set.
Yeah.
You got to go for the box set. And then I have to ask, before we stop, was your main character named after anyone in particular?
Yes. So
I don't know if we're allowed to say this,
yes,
but I had to ask.
Actually, so Eden Lepucky is a good friend of mine, and yours too. Yeah. And Eden is an amazing writing teacher. You should all go take her writing classes, writing workshops.
Writing Workshops LA. Yeah.
And I actually named 2 different characters after her. In Shade, the Changing Girl, there's a sexy panda who is Shade's boyfriend on her planet Meta, and his name is Lepuck. And that was because I was like writing the scene, and I was like, I need an alien name. And I looked over at my bookshelf and I saw Eden's name. I was like, Lepuck, that'll work, you know? And then I was trying to come up with a name for Eden, in Don't Cosplay, and it was I was doing it at the same time, and I was like there, and I was like, you know what, Eden's a great name, and I'm just gonna go with Eden. And Kupferman was my childhood friends that I used to go spend Christmas and Thanksgiving with. Their last name was Kupferman, and so
it worked out.
Yeah.
No, I know. I was just like, I have a suspicion.
Yeah.
And Eden was one of the first guests on the show.
Oh my God, she's amazing.
Yeah. So I just thought that was a really funny one.
I love Tuckerizing people. Like, I think it's fun. Like I did with my grandma. You know, I'm always putting people's names into my books, or, you know, people's last names into my books. I mean, I think that's kind of fun.
Yeah, it's like the thing in dictionaries where they have those, what are they called? I'm of course going to forget the word now, but there's this phenomenon in dictionaries, and it's a copyright issue. Mount weasels, which is the best word ever. But they will make up fake words and definitions and put them at periodic places in dictionaries, so that if somebody were to take the whole dictionary, copy it, and publish it as their own dictionary, then the original dictionary would be alerted. And the only way you can tell it's not, you know, a real dictionary is to have these mount weasels put periodically in the dictionary, which is one of my favorite things. So I think about these little like Easter eggs in people's books as like, it's like your own personal mount weasel.
Yeah. Yeah, it's my own personal mount weasel.
It's a good bumper sticker. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I hope everybody, even if you don't normally read books for young people, I recommend this one. As Cecil said, it's a good one for a nice bath. Or yeah. I highly recommend a fireplace and a cushy chair as a good reader.
Poolside could work.
Yeah, poolside also good, depending on what climate you're in as you're listening.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Secret Library podcast. The show is produced by me, Caroline Donahue, and Frederick Barry McWilliams Jr., my tireless audio engineer. To get show notes for this episode and all other episodes, please visit secretlibrarypodcast.com. To get updates, literary love, and notification when new episodes are posted, sign up there for Footnotes, my newsletter. And to learn about life coaching with me to work on building your writing life, visit carolinedonahue.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Gold stars to everybody who leaves a rating and review on iTunes. We're so grateful. Until next time, happy reading.